and Rob went on a business trip and never made it home. So I already knew something was bad, but I didn't know that. So there was this slow motion discovery when he said, "Have you got somebody with you?" And I said, "Yes." And then he said the exact words, "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband deceased in a hotel room in Perth."
Life and death, today and tomorrow. We're not afraid to talk about the complexity around saying farewell. From the experts at Celebrating Life. Welcome, I'm Kate Morgan, co-founder and head of memorials at Tomorrow Funerals. I'm really excited today to have my friend here in the studio, Marie Alessi. After your husband, Marie, unexpectedly passed away from a brain aneurysm, you dedicated your life to allowing healing and creating happiness for your young family. Becoming a widow at the age of 45 obviously was nothing like you would have expected. I mean, you probably didn't. How could you even foresee that? I believe you had a really different approach to handling your grief, however, and I've been really interested to hear about that. Marie has written books. She has an incredible keynote speech called The Power of Grief. And I think it's really interesting for people to hear about creative and new ways to look at grief, especially something so huge as what you went through, so unexpected and shocking. So can you tell me a little bit about what happened? Take me back to the moment when your life changed.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you for having me, Kate. I'm really looking forward to unpacking that here with you. And it was a rather unexpected story, as you can imagine, as you just read as well. And in the prime of our lives, we were both 45, and Rob went on a business trip and never made it home. He passed away from a brain aneurysm, so it was completely instant. There was no pre-warning, there was no preparation for that. And the entire day was a constant trying of getting in touch with him. And
so just to clarify, you were trying to get in touch with him. You didn't know that he was unwell or anything had happened?
Nothing.
You were just trying. And where was he?
So Rob actually, I'm going to take you through the day because it was such a turning point in my life, as you can imagine, and this is why we're sitting here today. We walked Rob to the station on a Sunday, and it was beautiful. We were walking hand in hand, and the boys were on the scooter and on their bike, and we took him to the station because he would often catch the train. We lived so close to the station, he would catch the train to the airport, fly out to Perth for a business trip, and was meant to come home on the Friday after. So he had a week in Perth, and the night before Rob passed, so unexpectedly, we were on the phone. We had our usual conversation. Our conversation ended with, "I love you. I love you too." And he wanted to wake me up the next morning because my phone wasn't updating properly. And I said, "I need it as an alarm." He said, "Don't worry, babe, I'll wake you up." 7:30, he was supposed to wake me up. And I woke up at 7:31 looking at the clock thinking, something's not right. And I just had this instant, why is he not calling me? Rob was so reliable. If he would say, I wake you at 7:30, the phone would ring at 7:30 and not a minute later. So me waking up at 7:31 was already quite significant. I still remember those letters read, on my clock and thinking, okay. But then, as a mom, you get on with your day and the kids have to get to school and my little one was feeling off. And to cut a long story short, it went on till about lunchtime that I kept texting him and trying to call him. And then the texts got more and more anxious. I'm like, babe, I'm really starting to worry. What's going on? I can't get hold of you. And around lunchtime, I had this moment of, hold on, I'm going to ring the hotel where he's staying, because Rob would always leave his itinerary with me and vice versa. If we would go away, we would always, let each other know where we are. And so I called the hotel, and this was the most bizarre moment. As I'm talking to the hotel staff, and I remember the conversation so distinctly, I said, I know that my husband's staying with you. Please don't think I'm one of those freaked out wives stalking her husband, but I just, tried to get hold of him and I couldn't. And I started to worry about him. Could you please send somebody up to his room? And as I'm saying those words, I had a split second of a vision of Rob collapsing in a shower. And I remember shaking my head physically thinking, don't go there, Marie. Don't drive yourself crazy. Don't go there. But I said it to them. I said, and can you please check in the shower? I remember that. I thought, that's so weird. They must think I'm completely crazy, And that's exactly where they found him. Rob had collapsed in a shower. He had a brain aneurysm and died on the spot. So that was the turning point, as you can imagine. The boys were only 10 and 8.
did you find out that news? Who informed you of that?
It took another 4 excruciating hours until I finally received the phone call, because protocol is that they have to send police to your house to share this message with you. They're not allowed to share that on the phone. But the sergeant that I then talked to, he called me and he said, look, he literally told me that he broke protocol because he could see that I kept ringing and ringing, because they were at the scene. They were all there. As soon as they found Rob's body, an ambulance was called, police was called. So, they had people running in and out of the house, and there was people everywhere, police and the paramedics, and he could see that Rob's phone kept ringing and he could see my photo come up. So he just knew what was going on. And he said, look, I'm a dad of 2 boys. I can't even begin to imagine what you must have been going through. So he decided to call me.
When do you think you realised that your husband had passed away?
So that was a very bizarre moment for me, because when this sergeant called me, he introduced himself as a sergeant from the coroner's office. And that was probably, I don't know if I should call it the best or the worst bilingual moment in my life, because me growing up in Austria, I had never heard the word coroners before. I didn't know what that meant. I learned fast. So when I received that phone call and he told me Sergeant such and such from the coroner's office, I'm like, yeah. I was still waiting, like, did you have an accident? Did something happen, And then he said, he just asked me, have you got somebody with you? I said, yes, because I called my best friend, completely frantic, saying something's going on, something's not right. And Rob didn't turn up. Meanwhile, I already knew, because I talked to his boss, that he hadn't turned up at the appointment that he had to go to that day. So I already knew something was bad, but I didn't know that. So there was this slow motion discovery when he said, have you got somebody with you? And I said, yes. And then he said the exact words, I'm sorry to inform you that your husband deceased in a hotel room in Perth this morning. And that was it. That's how I found out. It was this whole, I often describe this moment like, imagine your favorite happy song playing on a record player, and all of a sudden the needle screeches and the music stops and everything goes into slow motion. That's how it felt. It takes your brain a moment and a half to process an information like that. There's this whole, hold on, rewind, there's something not right. You've just given me the wrong information. This can't be, in your brain, you're like completely negating that. But it took me a while, probably a few seconds. It feels like forever, but...
Yeah. I mean, what I think is amazing about you, and we're going to get to this, but when you say it took your brain a moment and a half to process, I think what's interesting about your story, Marie, overall, is that you processed a lot of this more quickly than a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about next. But, a moment and a half, my God, I mean, it could take some people a lifetime to process this. So tell me about what happened next.
Yeah. I want to take a very quick sidestep, and I'm going to keep this very brief because I do want to focus on what you just said, and it's very, very important to go there. But the reason why I feel that my approach to grief was so different to most people is because I have lived through it when I was 20. I lost my dad to cancer. It was a very, very different loss, not just because of a different relationship. Obviously, it's different to lose your dad or your husband, but it's also the way with my dad, there was this, he had cancer, and it was a very short lead up, but there was a lead up. And with Rob, there was no lead up. Rob was in the prime of his life. He was super healthy. He was a surfer. He was fit. So he always went to regular checkups, health checkups every 2 years. There was nothing that could have indicated that, not even in hindsight. We looked at the post-mortem report together, our GP and me. There was nothing that could have indicated it. So there was really no warning at all.
Wow.
So, yeah, when I received those news, I consider myself lucky, and I understand how bizarre that might sound in a situation like that. But Rob and I had the what-if conversation about 3 years prior to his passing, believe it or not. And it was a day where he came home late from work, and he called me on his way home. He said, babe, I'm going to be 2 hours late because there was an accident on Heathcote Road. And for those who don't know, Heathcote Road is a one-way road all the way through the national park. So if there's an accident, it is a huge detour, not just to take the next
in
left.
In the south of Sydney, yeah?
Yeah, exactly, south of Sydney. And we learned later on, or even on his way home, he learned that a young dad has lost his life. His daughter was only 16 months old, and on his way home from work, he collided with a truck and it was instant. So it really hit home for us because our boys were so young when we heard that. They were probably 4 and 6 or something. And that night we sat on our bed and we had that conversation. What would you do if something was to happen to me? You know, we asked each other that question, and I think we even cried. It was really touching. And so in a nutshell, the conclusion of this conversation was, if something was to ever happen to me, I would want you to create the happiest life possible for you and the boys.
Wow.
Because that's what love is. Love just wants you to be happy. You know, that was our nutshell. And that very sentence became my lighthouse in my darkest hour.
Love
just wants you to be happy.
Love just wants you to be happy. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. We have a lot of similarities in our story and some big life-changing moments at a very similar period.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is really interesting about our connection just
it's quite
recently.
remarkable, yeah.
And then you joining Tomorrow Funerals as well, which is another thing. But let's go back there again and tell me what happened next with your,
Well, the next thing for me was telling the boys. I knew that was the first thing I had to do. They were 10 and 8 at the time. So I know that the friend who sat with me said, do you want me to take the boys? And I said, there's no way. There's no way after what just happened that I would leave them behind anywhere. They have to come with me. I knew, like, from the moment we heard of Rob's passing, we were like this really strong bond. Like they always say a triangle is the strongest geometrical shape. And it was so true for us. We were already very close-knit beforehand. Everybody knew us as that couple, as that family. We were always lovey-dovey, they called us. I didn't mind. I loved that. Yeah. I owned it. I rocked it. But I knew they had to hear it first. And the thing is, there is no sugarcoating a message like your dad just passed. You cannot sugarcoat it. You literally have to say it. And I had 7 steps from my bedroom down to the living room where they were sitting and waiting for me in their martial arts uniform to take them to Hapkido training. And they were on their iPads, and I asked them to put the iPads down. And when they can just read you and they know that they put their iPads down instantly. And I held their hands and I told them, and I hugged them, and they cried and they screamed, and it was this absolute meltdown moment that pierced my heart. It was really the hardest thing I ever had to do in my entire life, by far.
Gosh, so that was the hardest moment of all of it?
It was. Even looking back now after all these years and after all the work that I've been doing, that was the hardest moment in my entire life, having to share that with the boys. And the reaction, I was not ready for that. You don't have time to prepare for that, and nobody can prepare you for it.
But incredible again that your instincts all along, because you follow your heart. I know that about you.
Always.
Should I take the children away? And no, you knew that they needed to. Yeah. And as hard as that was, and this is something that I talk to people about all the time, about children and grief.
Yeah.
Children are resilient. People say children are resilient, but what I believe is that children are no different to adults in terms of what they can withstand, or we're all as strong or as weak as we are. Just because they're children doesn't mean they're less strong. Children need the truth like anybody, because
exactly
otherwise they make up.
Thank you. Yes,
things.
Children need the truth. I just wanted to say that children are just a lot more straightforward. They don't do the fluffing around and making things more polite or sugarcoating it. As I said, you cannot sugarcoat a message like that. So I love that children are very straightforward. But there's also, people often say that children are so much more resilient. Yes, and they're also hugely vulnerable. They just lost their dad, for goodness sake.
And this is what I talk to people about in that because I work in the, the forefront of grief, and people will say, what should I say? How should I say it? There's no way that you can change the reality that is their lives now forever. Their dad has died at a young, when they're young. That is their life, and that is their thing, their cross to bear, or their thing they need to work through.
Yeah.
So the truth is the only way through, isn't it?
Yeah, and I remember Flynn, my oldest son, he was, as I said, he was 10 at the time. He looked at me after I said that and he said, "Who's going to look after us now, Mum?" And I said, I will look after you. I remember saying it twice. It was so important. And in hindsight, I'm thinking, I don't know who it was more important for them or for myself, but it was important for all three of us, for me to say that out loud, for us to hear it. And it was really something where, I don't know, we might talk about this later anyway, but I want to say this now, actually. So many people, because me working in the space of grief now too, a lot of people talk about this, oh, how hard is it to be a sole parent? And I always look at them thinking, I don't know. I never looked at sole parenting or parenting as hard or not hard. It is. Parenting it's a choice that we made. And it's not for everyone that they made a choice. For some people, it just happens. Let's not go there. But for Rob and I, it was an absolute conscious choice. We wanted to be parents with all our hearts. And yes, there are ups and downs. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are moments that are full of love and joy and other moments where you're like, where's the handbook? I didn't, But it's parenting and I freaking love it. I'm a parent with all my heart. I never once thought about, is this hard or not hard? Because that was just my role. And I feel I stepped into that in that very moment.
Wow.
I didn't think about it, that I'm now a sole parent or not. I just was. And I took it from there. And I remember in that very moment when Flynn asked me that question, and then Jed, my 8-year-old, looked at me and said, I'm only 8 and I'm not going to have a daddy anymore. That really pierced my heart. I remember that so vividly. And that's when I had Rob's voice in my head saying, like, create the happiest life possible for the boys and you.
Wow.
And that became my North Star in that very moment.
So, Marie, after that initial moment of finding out that absolutely terrible news, then you have to go into planning mode. I mean, you have to plan a funeral and then you have to bring him home. So tell me about that moment.
Yeah, so after I had that moment with the boys and I'm sharing the news and I'm hugging them and we're crying, I really gave it all the time in the world that it needed right there, right then. And then there was this moment where I thought, okay, what's next? We need to go and tell Rob's mum and dad. That was my next step. I'm like, I have to tell them. And I knew I didn't want them to find out over the phone. I knew I wanted to tell them in person. They live 40 minutes drive away. And I said to the boys, pack your stuff. We're going to tell Nana, we have to go. And they came with me. I had the same moment again, of this falling apart, of witnessing them falling apart. It was horrible. So we spent the night there, the whole family, friends, neighbors, everybody came together, and I felt so isolated in that moment. I felt not that they wouldn't include me, but I felt so alone in this entire world, and all I could focus on were my 2 boys sitting there. And I remember holding them both in my arms. His brother was nice enough to leave his room for us, so we stayed there, and we had the big bed. We could just, I had them to my left and to my right. I was crying myself to sleep. They were crying themselves to sleep. And I could feel that intensity of grief. It felt like somebody had poured a bucket of acid into my stomach. That's how it felt. And the next morning, I was supposed to ring that sergeant from the coroner's office back to see what the ins and outs were, because he said, somebody will have to identify Rob's body. And he said, look, if you want to, we can ask somebody from his work, because that's where he had the appointment for work. That I said, there's no way. I said, no way would I want anybody to identify my husband. I said, I'm coming. So it was a no-brainer for me. There's no way I would have wanted anybody to do that. And the next day we received the news that it was ready for us and we could go to the mortuary, and Rob's work booked the flights for us. My brothers-in-law, they, drove us home to pack a few things and drove us to the airport, rushing through the city because we literally just made it. Rob's boss was waiting at the airport for us. It was so beautiful that he was there to rush us to the gate, and it was incredible. And the plane was full, absolutely loaded, not one single spare seat. And we were seated in the very back row where the 4 seats are in the middle. And there was this gentleman to my right and my boys to my left, because I wanted to sort of protect them, if that makes sense. And I knew I had to tell the flight attendants, because I used to work as a flight attendant many years ago, and having somebody on board crying the entire time, not knowing what's going on, can be quite disturbing or worrying for them while they have a full plane. So I kind of felt like I had to tell them. And when I told them, I just completely fell apart. So I was sitting there on the plane for 5 hours, just having tears run down my face, trying to keep it together. They were so beautiful looking after my boys. I think they must have been on such a sugar high, because they got chocolate and hot chocolate, and they were like just showered with love and attention, which was so beautiful. And I was pretty much just, I had these 5 hours of not having to do anything. So I just had tears running down my face. We were greeted at the airport by our previous neighbours who moved to Perth, which was amazing, because the last thing I wanted was to stay in a hotel room in Perth. They took us in for about 3 nights, I think, and took us to the mortuary the next day, because by the time we arrived, it was too late with the time difference. And the next morning, they drove us to the mortuary. And I'm really glad that I had that night with the boys, where I could prepare them for what's to come.
How did you prepare them? What did you say?
I had this conversation with them, because while I was laying in bed, I'm like, they need to know what's going to happen tomorrow. Because I sort of knew, unfortunately, from when my dad passed. But weirdly enough, the one thing I thought of was that I had to prepare them that Rob's body is going to be cold. That was intense, but I had to tell them that. I didn't want them to experience that. I wanted to prepare them. I said, you have to imagine it as in, it's unfortunately, I have to say it as it is. It's like a fridge. They have to keep the body fresh. So Dad's body is going to be cold. I need to prepare you for that. And I gave them the option if they wanted to come with me or wait outside with my friends. They wanted to come inside. I'm so grateful for that moment that we had that. It was the most confronting, intense, and also beautiful and bonding moment that we had in a mortuary. We stood around Rob. He was on this bed, whatever you can call it, and it was a room that was just for us. They had put the body in a room where we could be with him, and I could feel his presence there. I could feel it so intensely with us. We're standing around. The heartbreaking moment was that Jed, my little one, wasn't even tall enough to reach, so he was climbing up on the side of that bed or whatever that is. And we were standing there, we were holding hands, and just when I thought of how on earth do you cut off that moment, how do you leave? It's so hard, because you think, oh, this is the last time I'm going to be with, his body. It's not really him anymore, but it was this moment of how do you leave? And in exact that moment, my older one says to me, I said, Mum, I think we should go now, because the longer we stay, the more sad we will become. So I think we should leave. And I said, I think you're right. And we did. So
was that a healing moment for you guys? Was that something
I think
you
it was
needed to
really, really important. It was so important for the boys to see it, for their processing of my dad has actually passed. I think it was extremely important for them to see that he has died.
I think that is often the case with the sudden death.
It's the closure.
Is that. I think sometimes if somebody's passed at a much older age and a family has spent time with somebody as they're dying in hospital, it's not always necessary. But it's
and that's also what the sergeant said to me. He said usually we have to do with people that are either older or there were obvious health issues, but your husband was so fit and so young. He said it really hit all of us really hard when we saw it, because we don't have to do with that on a daily basis. You think they do, but they don't. It's usually people where there are obvious reasons, And also the police officer who was on the scene first, she called me the day after and she said, I wanted to give you some space to process, but I can only imagine that you would have hundreds of questions and I'm here to answer every single one of them. She called me after hours. It was not her duty. It was not her thing that she had to. She did it because for the same reasons. She said, that really hit home for me. I don't have to do that every single day. This is not something that occurs on a daily or weekly basis. This was really out of the norm. It was the most beautiful connection because she also ended up in my movement in the group. She told me, she said, I'm obviously not under my official name. I just wanted you to know it's me. And that was so beautiful. So everything else after that was taken care of by insurance because it happened at a work trip. So the repatriation of the body, all these things. I was so grateful that I didn't have to organize that because I had no idea where to even start. But I had to organize a funeral, and that was a big thing, that whole, what we talked about, the whole upsell and, do you want a bigger coffin, better coffin, more flowers, bigger flowers? There's so much where you feel like, oh my God, are we talking about my loved one here? Or is it's such a business? And I'm not even going to mention names who we went with. They did a phenomenal job up until everything was over, and then it was cut off. Our compassion has been paid for, we're done, and this is what really, really drew me to Tomorrow Funerals, because you guys have got so much love and compassion and empathy, and I think that is so needed in that space. It's very rare in the funeral industry, and that's what drew me to you guys. That's what wants me to be part of Tomorrow Funerals.
Yeah. Oh, we're excited to have you on board, so thank you. I mean, there's so many things that you've said that I want to pick up on, and that earlier moment where you felt like you knew that he was in the shower. I mean, what is your belief system now? Did it change or was it the same? I love that question. Yeah. So I refer to it as a spiritual epiphany that I had, and it was only a few weeks after Rob passed. I remember that. And there was this moment in my bedroom where I had this moment of, we chose this. This is our soul contract. On a soul level, we have chosen this path. And there was this, oh my God, and it really added to my acceptance in a most beautiful way, because acceptance is often used in a sort of surrender, sort of rather negative way. Well, you got to accept it. That's not what I'm talking about. There was this really wholehearted accepting this, and it was not a flick the switch moment, but it started there, and it sort of transformed into a really strong spiritual belief that I now stand strong and share. I didn't even dare to share that at first. I thought, oh my God, people must think I'm losing it now because the poor widow, she's grieving. You don't know. When you say they must think I'm crazy, how did you feel that you were handling widowhood or becoming a widow differently to what was expected? What did you think was different back then?
What was different is that I focused on joy. I focused on happiness. I focused on the promise that Rob and I made to each other to create the happiest life possible. So from pretty much day dot, I was chasing happiness. And trust me when I say this, the first couple of days, weeks, I had no idea how to. But I knew where I was going, and I knew what I had to do, and I knew what I wanted to do, because that's what I would have wanted Rob to do if it was the other way around. That's what we promised to each other. And it was a promise that I didn't take lightheartedly. It was our future. So I did everything in my power to follow that promise and to follow those footsteps. I mean, for example, Rob and I had planned, and we had never shared that with anyone, not even the kids. Rob and I had planned to travel around the world in 2019. Long and behold, we did not know anything about COVID coming at that stage, but that was our plan. We had the entire itinerary cut out and stuck all over our cupboard at home, and it took me till probably only a few months ago. I still had it up because I was not ready to take it down. But we had the itinerary planned. We knew where we wanted to travel. We wanted to start up South America and travel through Europe and then South Asia and come back to Australia and homeschool the kids. And we had just started an online business that was going quite well. So we had all these planned. And then half a year before Rob passed away. So I could have gone like, okay, I can't do this right now. But instead I went like, so what can I do on my own? There's no way I'm going to travel for an entire year. There's no way, whilst grieving and putting a complete stop to the online business and my own business. I was still running a coaching business at the time, and I literally closed it down as soon as Rob passed because I had nothing left for my clients, nothing. Everything I had was for the boys and for myself. So from one day to the next, there was no cash flow, there was no business, there was no idea how to even do this, but I just went into this complete surrender and trust, and I felt this strong guidance from day dot. So I went into this space of, what can I do on my own? I'm not going to travel on my own for a year. I'm not going to homeschool them while I'm grieving, while I don't have a business, but I can do that. And I was so supported. I was so supported financially, emotionally. I had massive support, and it was one friend of mine, I'm not allowed to ever mention that name, but I was gifted a really large amount of money to travel and to do whatever I want with it. That were the exact words. And I chose to travel with the boys because I knew we needed to get away. I knew we had to get away from all these expectations of how we're supposed to grieve, how we're supposed to fall apart. And I needed to go somewhere where nobody knew us, where we were not seen as, the boys who just lost their dad or the poor widow. We were 3 people traveling and nobody knew our background story. And I traveled around the world with them for 2 months, and it was the most amazing thing we could have ever done.
How soon after your husband's passing?
5 months after Rob died, we jumped on a plane and left. Yeah.
So you were doing things really differently right from the beginning.
Very differently, yeah.
Tell me what else you did differently, because I know you've written books and you've got a keynote speech about this very subject, and I know you teach a course online on helping people get through this kind of grief. So what's the sort of principles of what you did? And
I will share the story how this actually all originated, because it all started with a massive breakdown. And so many people often say, a breakthrough is always preceded by a breakdown, and that was certainly the case. I remember the day so vividly because it was in the same week of Rob's funeral. We had a midweek funeral on a Wednesday. 500 people came to the funeral, and we had a massive celebration of life for Rob, because that's how I felt that he would have wanted it. And luckily I knew that Rob wanted to be cremated and his ashes to go back into the ocean. He was such a, he was such an ocean lover. He was a diver, surfer, spearfisher, everything ocean related was Rob, a typical Aquarius, So we had this massive celebration of life for him, and it was really beautiful. I would have never expected my husband's funeral or the celebration of life to be such a beautiful, joyful day. I would have never expected that. But the room was full of people who loved him, full of people who shared stories about him, funny stories, beautiful stories. And Rob was one of those people. I always said that TV series should have been called Everybody Loves Rob, not Everybody Loves Raymond, because it was really like that. I've never met a person who could have said a negative word about Rob. He was just such a beautiful, down-to-earth person. And that same week of the funeral, on the Sunday, I had to walk Jed down the aisle for his first Holy Communion on my own. That was hard. We had all eyes on us because we live in a small country town. Everybody knew about his passing by that stage, and everybody looked at me, and I had tears rolling down my face, and I could hardly breathe. I was just trying to keep it together for Jed. I wanted him to have a beautiful day, despite everything that had happened. And I remember after we walked past the altar and he had his first Holy Communion, and I was walking back, and we were seated all the way at the back, and I walked straight out. I let him walk to his godfather, which was Rob's best friend, and I just looked at him. He took Jed, and I walked straight back out, and his brother was standing there. He just hugged me, and I just fell apart. I was sobbing unconsolably, and that night I had a massive breakdown. I remember I was in the kitchen, and the boys were upstairs brushing their teeth, and I heard them. They were starting to bicker about something. I don't know what it was, and I called up a couple of times. Can you just please, boys, come on, and the voice get louder and louder, and nothing seemed to get through to them. And I remember that moment when I just snapped and I just screamed up. I was like, boys, I just need peace and quiet. It was just burst out of me. It was like a valve had opened and I couldn't close it anymore. It's like a pressure cooker, Once that valve is open, I remember I just fell apart. I was yelling that sentence louder and louder until I was screaming it on top of my lungs. And I remember finding myself on the kitchen floor, whacking kitchen cupboards, screaming that sentence until I just screamed. And then everything was quiet. And it was such an out-of-body experience. I remember as if I was watching myself fall apart, but I can't even remember how I fell to the kitchen floor. I can't remember that moment at all. But I remember that quiet, not peaceful at all, but that quiet space afterwards. And all of a sudden it clicked. And I was like, oh my God, the boys, they are upstairs. And So I walked upstairs and it felt like this reverse scene of, coming down those 7 steps to tell them, and now I'm walking up those 7 steps to calm them down. And I had to have this conversation with them on the spot. I was so not prepared for this conversation, but I talked to them about, how they receive support at school with the school counsellor. And I looked at them and I said, I think I need support too. And my 10-year-old, bless him, I have no idea how on earth he got so wise so quickly. He said, I think that's a good idea, Mum. And the week after, I sat in Emily's office, a beautiful positive psychologist, and I shared with her my story, and we worked through it all. And then there was this very, very pivotal moment while we were sitting here together having this conversation. And that moment was me sharing with her how it was such a burden, how people expected me to fall apart. They expected me to sit in this darkness and heaviness of grief. Yet here am I trying my everything to create a happy and joyful life for my boys. There was so much pressure. And she looked at me and smiled, and she said to me so calmly, so what does grief mean to you, Marie? And to my own surprise, the first word that came up was empowerment. And I said, oh my God, I have no idea where that came from. It was so bizarre. I did not expect that word. And so we talked through that, and I told her what that meant for me. And, there is this primal force that comes with experiencing a loss like that. And I always say not even childbirth came close to that primal force I felt on that day where I fell apart in the kitchen. And I never wanted to go back there. It was horrible. It was really horrible to experience that. I felt so powerless, and yet there was such a force. So for me, it was that, how can you harness that force and use it for you to heal and to move forward? And I looked at her and I said, you know what? I think I have to write a book about this.
Wow.
And she said, I think you should. And so I did. 5 weeks after that, I published my first book, Loving Love After Loss.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. And I am fascinated by that, the way that you look at this incredible, as you say, the most difficult thing you ever went through. Some of these things you're talking about, the day that you had to tell your children, the day that he died.
Yeah.
But you turn it around just naturally. That's your natural instinct, your gut instinct, to turn it around, to search for more meaning, for empowerment, for healing. And I just love that, you could inspire other people to have permission to not be the widow that people think, and maybe those constructs of what a widow should be, maybe they're in our own mind anyway. But it's so interesting that you just did it so differently. I'm amazed.
I felt it was really needed to change the narrative of grief, and that's what led me to do the TEDx talk. I did a TEDx talk on redefining our image of a widow, because I just think it is such a label. We are labeled. Like even myself, I have to be honest, like before my husband passed, when I think of a widow, I think of an old lady wearing black and falling apart and her life is over, basically, And I thought, but this is not what we have chosen for each other, and this is not what I would want to choose for my boys. I want them to have a beautiful life, So people often go into this space of, well, I had no choice in that. And apart from the fact that from a spiritual level I see that differently, let's just set that fact aside for now. You always have a choice in how you respond to something that happens in your life.
That's the only choice you do have, isn't it? How you respond.
Yeah, and that's where the empowerment lies, in the way you respond, in the way how you choose to live your life from there on in. What do you do with it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So your work now, helping people to heal, and other things that you're doing, like coming to work with us at Tomorrow Funerals. So tell me about your decision to work with life celebrations and help people.
That was a really, really beautiful journey, actually. A bittersweet, but rather beautiful journey. One of our friends, Annika, was diagnosed with bowel cancer, very, very early stage in her life at 34. So she had been fighting really hard for 7 or 8 years. Her kids even younger than mine, so it was really hard to watch. And when Annika passed, her friends basically asked me if I would do the celebration of life for her, and I said I'd be honoured. And weirdly enough, I was sitting in Melbourne airport when I received that message that Annika had passed, and I just saw it where they asked me, and I just wrote back saying like, absolutely, just at the airport, we'll touch base when I get back. It was an instant yes for me. That was my very first time I ran a celebration of life, but I just knew I had what it took because of my background, and because I knew that I wanted to bring joy and lightness into that celebration, because I knew it was needed. Her kids needed it, her family needed it, and I've literally done everything involved in helping her mom write the speech, translating it because she's from Germany. That was sort of the entry point.
And that's huge because it's such a,
it was personal, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of people walk up to me afterwards and like, you should do that for a living. And I said, well, I sort of do. Never done that part, but this is my background. And they were all just blown away. It was hugely positive and beautiful feedback. And again, another seed planted. I thought, yeah, that's something.
Well, I think that's the thing. It's when it comes to these huge moments in life, you follow your gut. If you do, I mean, that's how I ended up in this space as well. And so have you. It's really interesting to watch people when they're at that stage and they're following their gut and they're having, finding these incredible journeys in doing things that you would never expect.
Yeah.
But finding them to be so fulfilling. And that's what I see from you. Obviously, you are so fulfilled in your work. Yeah. Is that what you think?
There's so many moments where people say, oh, isn't that so heavy that you're constantly working in a space of grief? And I'm like, well, I don't see it as such. I constantly work in a space of healing. I find so much joy and fulfillment and purpose in helping people come through this journey and find purpose and joy and love in their life again. I see so much purpose in that. I find a lot of fulfillment in that. And, one day, this is actually so beautiful because this is what led me to you, Kate. I was sharing my story on Monica Rosenfeld's stage. She does Stories That Stir, which is very up and coming, and it's very similar to TEDx. And I shared my story, and I called that short version of it Empowerment in Grief. And there was a lady there, Diana. She works for Sydney Uni Research Department. She said, I missed your speech. I so wanted to watch it. So I sent her the recording, and then she sent me this article back, like a one-page huge article about a lovely lady who runs an amazing funeral business in Melbourne. Her name is Kate Morgan. And I was like, oh my God, I need to reach out to that lady. And that's how I connected with you. And I said, we really need to talk. And it was just amazing. You and I, our first conversation, the let's do a 15-minute chat turned into over an hour conversation. And there was this, oh my God, me too. There was this alignment that I felt, and I know that you felt it too. And when you told me about your business, Tomorrow Funerals, and that it's Melbourne-based and that you are potentially looking for somebody to do that in Sydney, I'm like, pick me. So
that was a hard choice.
I booked my flight. I flew to Melbourne, and now you are here, and we're having this conversation. And I'm so happy.
Marie, thank you so much for your time today. I've just been fascinated with your story since I first heard it, and I'm so happy to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to what's to come for both of us.
You've been listening to Life and Death, Today and Tomorrow. I'm Kate Morgan from Tomorrow Funerals. If you'd like to hear more fascinating conversations about death, dying and celebrating life, make sure you follow. To watch some of the important moments from today's episode, visit our Instagram at tomorrow.stories. You'll find a link for that in the show notes.